What would you do if you found a dying woman in a blizzard, and the child she pressed into your arms turned out to belong to the most powerful, most broken, most dangerous man in England? What would you do if saving that child cost you everything? Your home, your livelihood, your name, and the only thing that kept you alive on the frozen moors was the shadow of a man who would not show his face. Keep listening. I'm going to tell you a story tonight that will make you feel things. I'm warning you now. You might need a moment afterward, but I promise you, it's worth it. This is Aristocratic Hearts, where the romance is intense, the stakes are high, and the endings are everything you've been hoping for. Now, before we begin, where are you? What time is it where you are? Whether you're listening at dawn or midnight, I want to know. Drop your location in the comments. And if you've been here before, welcome back. If this is your first time, you picked a good one. Tonight's story begins in a place most people never go. Not a ballroom, not a London townhouse, not even a country estate with manicured gardens and imported champagne. Tonight's story begins on the Yorkshire moors in January of 1843, in the kind of cold that kills, with a woman who had nothing and a man who had lost everything, and a child who would bring them both back from the dead. But we are not starting at the beginning. We are starting in the middle. On a night in March, 2 months after the blizzard, in a gamekeeper's cottage on the edge of the Silverton estate, where Marianne Croft was holding a baby who was not hers and listening to men try to break down her door. There were 3 of them. She could tell by the voices, 2 rough local, the kind of men who took coin for work they did not ask questions about, and one that was smoother, more deliberate, belonging to someone who gave orders rather than followed them. The door shuddered on its hinges. Pearl, tucked against Marianne's chest in a sling made from a torn bedsheet, stirred but did not cry. She had learned in her short life the particular stillness that comes when the world outside is not safe. Marianne pressed her back against the far wall. The bolt she had fitted herself, an iron bar driven through brackets she had hammered into the frame with a stone because she could not afford nails, held. But it would not hold forever. The wood around the brackets was old, damp, the kind of wood that gave way when you leaned on it too hard. Open the door, the smooth voice again, patient, almost polite. We are here on the authority of the magistrate. The child is to be surrendered to the parish. Marianne said nothing. She had learned that too. The uselessness of arguing with men who had already decided what they were going to do. The door shuddered again. One of the brackets groaned, and then, from somewhere outside, from the darkness beyond the circle of their lantern, light, a sound, not a voice exactly, something lower, something that came from a chest rather than a throat, a sound like a large animal shifting its weight in the dark. The pounding stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that has a texture. Thick, breathing, watchful. "Who's there?" one of the rough voices said. There was an edge to it now. The edge of a man who has spent his life on these moors and knows what sounds belong to the night and what sounds do not. No answer. But the darkness shifted. Marianne, watching through the crack between the door and the frame, saw a shape detach itself from the tree line, tall, broad, moving with the unhurried certainty of something that has no predator. He stepped into the lantern light, and the 3 men saw what Marianne had known for weeks, that whatever lived in the tree line beyond her cottage was not an animal. He was filthy. His hair hung past his shoulders in matted ropes. His coat, what remained of it, was torn and crusted with mud and what might have been blood. His boots were split at the seams. His beard obscured most of his face, but his eyes were perfectly, terrifyingly clear, grey, cold. The eyes of a man who had spent months outside the borders of his own sanity and had clawed his way back just far enough to be functional. He looked at the three men. He looked at the door they had been trying to break. He looked at the cottage where Marianne stood with his child pressed against her heart. And then he spoke. The first words Marianne had ever heard him say. The first words anyone had heard the Duke of Silverton say in 7 months. Leave. One word, spoken quietly, with the kind of authority that does not need volume, because it has never in its entire existence been disobeyed. The two rough men ran. They did not hesitate, did not look at each other, did not wait for instruction from the smooth-voiced man who had hired them. They simply turned and fled into the darkness, like rabbits flushed from a hedge. The smooth-voiced man, and Marianne would learn his name later, Sir Aldous Pembroke, magistrate of Thornsby, a man whose authority over that village was absolute and whose corruption was older than the church, stood his ground. He was not a coward. He was something worse. He was a man who believed that his power made him untouchable. "Your Grace," he said. His voice was steady, but his hand had moved to the pistol at his belt. "We had heard you were indisposed." The Duke said nothing. He simply stood there, 6 feet and 2 inches of ruin and rage, and looked at Sir Aldous Pembroke the way a wolf looks at something that has wandered into the wrong territory. Sir Aldous held that gaze for perhaps 5 seconds. Then he turned and walked away into the dark. He did not run. He maintained his dignity to the last. But he left, because whatever Sir Aldous Pembroke believed about his own authority, he understood in that primal, wordless way that all men understand when confronted with something genuinely dangerous, that the man standing in front of him was beyond his jurisdiction. The Duke watched him go. Then he turned to the door. Marianne unbolted it. They looked at each other. She, small and thin and steady-eyed, with a baby in a sling and dirt under her nails and the particular quiet courage of a woman who has survived alone on the moors for 2 months. He, enormous and feral and barely human, with eyes that held something she could not yet name. Pearl made a sound, a small, bright, unmistakable sound. The sound of a baby who recognizes something. She reached out from the sling with both hands, fingers opening and closing, and laughed. She laughed at him, this enormous, terrifying, ruined man. And the baby laughed and reached for him with the absolute certainty of a creature who knows, without language or logic, exactly who she belongs to. The Duke stared at the child. His hands, large, scarred, shaking, rose from his sides. He looked at Marianne. Something in his face cracked. Not broke. Cracked. The way ice cracks when the river beneath it begins to move again after a long frozen winter. Marianne lifted Pearl from the sling and held her out. He took her. He held his daughter for the first time since the night she was born. The night his wife died. The night he was told both twins were lost. The night his mind had simply stopped working. And something happened to his face that Marianne would remember for the rest of her life. It did not crumble. It did not soften. It rearranged. Every hard line, every feral edge, every month of madness and grief shifted and reformed around this single, impossible fact. She was alive. His child was alive. And this woman, this stranger, had kept her so. He sank to his knees in the doorway of the gamekeeper's cottage, clutching the baby against his chest, and made a sound that Marianne had never heard a human being make. It was not weeping, exactly. It was deeper than that. More fundamental, the sound of a man returning to himself. Marianne stood over him and did not touch him, and did not speak, and did not look away. She understood, with the instinct of a woman who had known her own share of grief, that this moment was not hers. It belonged to him and to Pearl, and to whatever lay between them that the world had tried to sever. After a long time, he looked up at her. "You," he said. His voice was raw, destroyed. "You kept her alive." "Yes." He looked at her the way no one had ever looked at her in her life, not with gratitude. It was too large for gratitude. Not with love. It was too early for love. With something older than both. Something that had no name in any language Marianne knew. Then he stood, still holding Pearl, and walked back into the trees. But that is the middle of the story. And to understand what happened in that doorway, to understand what it cost Marianne Croft to be standing in that cottage at all, we need to go back to the beginning, to January, to the blizzard, to the night everything changed. Now it is important to understand something about a woman like Marianne Croft in 1843 England before we go any further, because the choice she was about to make, the choice that would cost her everything, only makes sense when you understand exactly how little she had to lose and how much that little meant. In 1843, a woman without a husband, without family connections, and without independent wealth existed in a kind of legal twilight. She was not quite a person in the eyes of the law. She could not vote. She could not serve on a jury. She could not attend university. If she earned wages, as Marianne did with her needle, those wages were hers only so long as she remained unmarried. The moment she took a husband, every penny she earned, every possession she owned, even the clothes on her back became his property. But remaining unmarried carried its own penalties. An unmarried woman past the age of 20 was an object of suspicion. An unmarried woman who lived alone was an object of scandal. And an unmarried woman who defied the will of her community was an object of destruction. Marianne was 22 years old. She lived in a single room above the draper's shop in Thornsby, a village of perhaps 200 souls on the edge of the Yorkshire moors. She was a seamstress, skilled, quiet, reliable. She mended the good dresses of the farmers' wives, and occasionally, when someone in the village needed a christening gown or a burial shroud, she produced work so fine that even the women who disliked her could not fault it. She earned enough to pay her rent, feed herself modestly, and set aside a few shillings each quarter against the eventuality of illness or injury. She had no family. Her mother had died when she was 16. Her father, a tenant farmer who drank, had followed 2 years later, leaving her nothing but his debts, which she had spent 3 years paying off with her needle. She was, in other words, a woman balanced on the thinnest possible margin. One bad month, one illness, one lost client, one act of spite from the draper's wife, and she would fall. And in 1843 England, when a woman without means fell, there was no net. There was only the workhouse. And in the workhouses of Yorkshire in the 1840s, those grim monuments to the new poor law of 1834, conditions were so deliberately cruel that many preferred death. This was Marianne's world on the night of January the 14th, when the blizzard came. It arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was merely grey, the flat, sullen grey of a Yorkshire winter, and the next, the wind came down off the moors like something with teeth. Snow fell so thick and fast that by 8 o'clock in the evening, the road through Thornsby had disappeared entirely. By 9, the drifts were waist-high. By 10, the temperature had dropped to a level that killed livestock in their stalls and turned the water in the horse troughs to solid blocks of ice. Marianne was in her room, sewing by candlelight, a commission for Mrs. Hartley, the vicar's wife, who wanted her Sunday dress taken in at the waist, when she heard the sound. Not the wind, something beneath the wind. A voice, thin, desperate, already failing. She went to the window and saw nothing. The snow was a white wall. But the sound came again. Closer now, directly below. And this time she heard what it was, a woman, crying for help. What happened next is the moment that defined Marianne Croft's life. She could have stayed where she was. No one would have blamed her. No one would have known. The blizzard would have buried the woman by morning, and the snow would have kept it secret until the thaw. Every practical consideration, and Marianne was, by necessity, a deeply practical woman, argued for remaining inside. The cold was lethal. She had no coat heavy enough for the conditions. If she went out and could not find her way back, she would die. She went out. She found the woman in the ditch beside the village lane, perhaps 30 yards from the draper's shop. She was young, younger than Marianne, perhaps 19 or 20, and she was wearing clothes that made no sense for this place or this weather. Fine wool, kid gloves soaked through, a travelling cloak lined with silk that had been no match for the storm. She was half buried in snow, and her lips were blue and her eyes were glassy with the peculiar calm that comes just before the body surrenders to the cold. And in her arms, wrapped in a shawl that had once been white cashmere and was now sodden and frozen, was a baby, perhaps 3 weeks old, tiny, silent, but alive. Marianne could see the faint, rhythmic movement of the shawl where the child breathed. Marianne dropped to her knees in the snow and took the woman's hand. It was like holding a stone. "Can you stand?" she said. "My room is just there. Can you walk?" The woman looked at her. Something passed between them. Not words, not even understanding, but something more fundamental. Recognition. One woman seeing another and knowing, without explanation, that she could be trusted. "Take her," the woman said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Take the baby. She must be kept warm. Promise me." "I'll take you both. Come, stand up." "I cannot feel my legs." Marianne tried. She pulled. She braced herself against the wind and hauled at the woman's arms, but the cold had gone too deep. The woman's body was shutting down, organ by organ, in the systematic and irreversible way that extreme cold dismantles a human being. She was dying. They both knew it. "Her name is Pearl," the woman said. She pressed the bundle into Marianne's arms with the last strength she possessed. Tell them she is the daughter of—" The wind took the words. Or perhaps she never finished them. Her eyes closed. Her hand, which had been gripping Marianne's sleeve, went slack. Marianne knelt in the snow with a dead woman's child in her arms and the blizzard howling around her like something alive, and she made her choice. She stood. She wrapped the baby inside her own shawl, pressing the small body against her chest where her heartbeat and her warmth could reach it. And she fought her way back to the draper's shop, through snow that wanted to pull her down, through wind that wanted to strip the warmth from her bones, through a night that wanted to kill them both. She made it. She bolted the door. She built up the fire until the room was stifling. She stripped the wet shawl from the baby and wrapped her in the only dry blanket she owned and held her against her skin. Flesh to flesh, the oldest and most effective treatment for cold, and she sat through the night, feeding the child drops of warmed milk from a rag, watching the tiny blue fingernails slowly turn pink, listening to the breath that grew stronger hour by hour. By dawn, the baby was crying. A furious, indignant, magnificently alive cry that filled Marianne's small room like a declaration of war against everything that had tried to end her. Marianne named her nothing. The woman had said Pearl, so Pearl she was. The blizzard lasted 2 more days. When it broke, the village dug itself out and found the body in the ditch. They also found the remains of a carriage, overturned in a snowdrift 1/2 a mile north of the village, the horses dead in their traces, the driver frozen at his seat. It was a quality carriage, the kind that belonged to wealth, to consequence, to a world that had no business being on the moors in January. And then the questions began. Who was the woman? Where had she come from? Whose child was this? And why? This was the question that mattered most, the question that would decide Marianne's fate. What was to be done with the baby? The village decided quickly. The vicar called a meeting in the church hall. Marianne was not invited to speak, but she went anyway, holding Pearl in the crook of her arm, and stood at the back while the men of Thornsby, because it was the men who decided, always the men, debated her future. The consensus was unanimous. The child was to be surrendered to the parish. She would be placed in the Thornsby workhouse or sent to a foundling home in York. Or, and this was spoken with the particular briskness of people who are discussing the disposal of an inconvenience, left at the door of a church in one of the larger towns where such things were more common and less disruptive. Marianne listened. She held Pearl. And when they were done, when every man in the room had spoken and not one of them had asked her opinion, and not one of them had looked at the baby as though she were a person, Marianne said, "No." The silence that followed was not the productive kind. No? The vicar, Mr. Thwaite, was a thin man with a thin voice who administered his parish the way a clerk administers a ledger, with attention to the columns and no interest in the human beings behind the numbers. "Miss Croft, this is not your decision. The child was placed in my arms by a dying woman. I will not place her in a workhouse. You cannot keep her. You are, forgive me, you are unmarried, without family, without means sufficient to... I can keep her. The parish will not support this arrangement. I am not asking the parish for support." The meeting erupted, not into shouting. These were Yorkshire people, and Yorkshire people did not shout in churches, but into a concentrated, venomous murmuring that was, in its way, far worse. The draper's wife, Mrs. Buckle, who had always resented Marianne for being younger, prettier, and more skilled with a needle than she had ever been, spoke first. "She wants the child for the attention," she said, loud enough for the room. "Mark my words, a single woman with a baby she claims is not hers. We all know what that looks like." And there it was. The accusation that Marianne had known was coming. The one that, in a village like Thornsby, was worse than theft, worse than violence, worse than anything except perhaps murder. The suggestion that the baby was hers, that she had concealed a pregnancy, that the story about the dying woman in the snow was a fabrication designed to disguise her own sin. It was not true. Every person in that room knew it was not true. Marianne had been visible in Thornsby every day for the past year, working, shopping, attending church, and no one had seen any evidence of pregnancy, because there had been none. But the truth did not matter. What mattered was the story. And the story that Mrs. Buckle was offering, the fallen woman, the secret baby, the convenient blizzard, was far more entertaining than the reality. Sir Aldous Pembroke, the magistrate, ended the meeting with a ruling. The child was to be surrendered within the week. If Miss Croft refused, she would be charged with defiance of a parish order, and the child would be taken by force. Marianne left the church hall with Pearl in her arms and walked back to the draper's shop. By the time she arrived, the draper, Mr. Buckle, husband of the venomous Mrs. Buckle, was waiting at the door. "I'll need the room cleared by tomorrow," he said. He could not look at her. "Wife's orders." Marianne packed her things that night, her sewing kit, her mother's thimble, 2 dresses, a blanket, the few shillings she had saved, and a brooch, a small thing, a single pearl set in tarnished silver that she had found pinned inside the dead woman's cloak. She had kept it because it seemed wrong to leave it, and because some instinct she could not explain told her it mattered. She walked out of Thornsby before dawn, carrying Pearl and everything she owned, and she did not look back. There was nothing to look back at. The village had made its judgment. She was cast out, not by law, not by formal decree, but by the collective, suffocating will of a community that had decided she was a problem and solved her by elimination. The only sound as she left was the crunch of her boots on the frozen lane and the thin, high cry of a milk cart's wheel somewhere behind her. Not one door opened, not one curtain shifted, not one person in Thornsby watched her go, because watching would have required acknowledging that she was a person leaving, not merely a difficulty being resolved. She walked north, into the moors, into the empty, wind-scoured landscape where the heather was brown and dead, and the sky sat low on the hills like a grey lid, and the only sounds were the wind and the curlews and the distant, mournful bleating of sheep. She found the cottage on the second day, an old gamekeeper's cottage on the edge of the Silverton estate, abandoned, half-ruined, but with 4 walls and a roof that mostly held and a fireplace that drew. She had no right to be there. The land belonged to the Duke of Silverton, though no one in these parts spoke of him any more. The Duke had gone mad, the locals said, gone mad with grief after his wife died, and the babies, twins they were, had died with her. He wandered his own estate like a ghost. His brother had tried to have him committed. His steward had resigned. The great house stood empty and dark on its hill, and the tenants managed their own affairs because there was no one left to manage them. Marianne settled into the cottage. She blocked the gaps in the walls with mud and straw. She gathered dead wood for the fire. She fashioned a cradle from a drawer she found in the ruined pantry. She fed Pearl with goat's milk bought from a farm 2 miles distant, walking there and back in bitter cold, the baby wrapped inside her cloak against her chest. Because she could not feed the child herself, and goat's milk was the nearest thing to mother's milk that the countryside could provide. And she survived, day by day, night by frozen night. Through February's grey monotony, through the slow, aching thaw of early March, through wind and rain and the particular loneliness of a woman who has no one in the world except an infant who cannot yet speak. It was in the 3rd week, perhaps the 18th or 19th day, that she noticed the food. A rabbit, skinned and cleaned, left on the flat stone beside the cottage door. She found it at dawn. No tracks in the mud that she could see, no indication of who had left it or when. She cooked it and fed Pearl the broth and ate the meat herself and felt, for the first time in weeks, something other than the gnawing, persistent hunger that had become her constant companion. The next day, there was bread, coarse, dark, the kind baked in a farm kitchen, and a stoppered bottle of fresh milk. The day after that, a bundle of dry firewood, stacked neatly against the cottage wall. Marianne sat in the doorway that evening with Pearl in her lap and looked at the tree line, that dark border of oak and ash and hawthorn that marked the edge of the moor and the beginning of the Silverton woods, and she understood that she was being watched. She was not afraid. That was the strange thing. She should have been terrified. A woman alone, miles from anyone, with no weapon and no protector, and a baby who depended entirely on her survival. The rational response to an unknown presence in the trees was fear. But Marianne had used up her fear in the blizzard, and the church hall, and the walk across the moors with a newborn strapped to her chest, and what was left in its place was something quieter and more durable. Pragmatism. Observation. The steady, measuring gaze of a woman who had learned to assess threats with the same precision she used to cut cloth. Whoever was leaving the food was not trying to harm her. If they wanted her gone, they would not be feeding her. If they wanted the baby, they would not leave bread beside the door and retreat before she woke. They were, and this was the conclusion that settled into her mind with the weight of certainty, they were keeping her alive. "Thank you," she said to the trees. Her voice sounded strange in the open air. She had not spoken aloud to another human being in nearly 3 weeks. "Whoever you are, thank you." The trees said nothing. The wind moved through them. A blackbird sang from somewhere deep in the canopy. But there was a quality to the silence that felt to Marianne, and she could not have explained this to anyone, could not have justified it with logic or evidence, like listening. She began to talk to the tree line, not constantly, not in the way of madness, but in the evening, when she sat in the doorway with Pearl and watched the light leave the moors. She spoke. She told the trees about her day, about Pearl's progress, her first smile, her first attempt to grip Marianne's finger with her tiny fist, the way she turned her head toward the sound of birdsong. She told them about the cottage repairs, the leak she had patched in the roof, the stone she had fitted to replace the broken one in the hearth. She told them once about her mother and the thimble, and what it was like to sew by candlelight in a room that smelled of damp wool and tallow. She never saw him, not clearly. Once, at dusk, she caught the shape of him at the far edge of the clearing. Impossibly tall, impossibly still, like a standing stone that had learned to breathe. Once, at dawn, she found boot prints in the frost outside the door. Large, heavy, the stride of a man well over 6 feet. And once, in the middle of the night, she heard something that might have been singing. Low, tuneless, barely there, coming from somewhere between the cottage and the trees. Not a song exactly. More like a sound a man makes when he is trying to remember what music is. She learned his patterns. He came at night and left before dawn. He never approached the cottage when she was outside, as though her proximity was a boundary he had set for himself and would not cross. He left food every 2 or 3 days. Always adequate, always appropriate. Meat, bread, milk, once a small pot of honey that Marianne dissolved in warm water for Pearl because the child had developed a cough, and honey was the only remedy Marianne could think of. Someone was watching her closely enough to know what she needed before she knew it herself. Now, it is important that we pause here and understand something about Constantine Vane, the 6th Duke of Silverton, because the man in those trees was not, as the villagers believed, simply mad. His condition was both more specific and more devastating than that, and to comprehend what was happening to him requires understanding how the Victorian world dealt with grief, which is to say, badly. In 1843, there was no word for what we might now recognize as a complete psychological collapse. There was no framework, no treatment, no language for the catastrophic disintegration of a mind under unbearable loss. What there was, instead, was a system of moral and medical judgment that classified such suffering as either spiritual weakness or hereditary insanity, and treated both with the same blunt instruments: confinement, restraint, and in the worst cases, the asylum. Constantine Vane had been, before his wife's death, a man of formidable capability. At 33, he controlled estates spanning 3 counties, managed a fortune of £38,000 per annum, sat in the House of Lords, and was regarded by his peers as one of the most intelligent and ruthless political minds of his generation. He was not a warm man, he was not an easy man, but he was, by every measure that his society valued, a success. His wife, Lady Sophia Vane, had died in August of 1842, 5 months before the blizzard, giving birth to twins. The attending physician, a man more comfortable with gout than with childbirth, had told Constantine that both children were stillborn. This was not true. One child, a boy, had indeed been born dead, but the girl, Pearl, had been alive, and in the chaos of Lady Sophia's hemorrhage and death, a single person had known: Mrs. Renwick, Lady Sophia's personal attendant, who had been present at the birth and who had seen, in the few seconds before the physician turned his attention elsewhere, the girl-child draw breath. What happened next was the work of Lord Vidor Vane, Constantine's uncle, a man whose cruelty operated with the precision of a machine and whose motivations we will come to shortly. It was Lord Vidor who ensured that the physician's report listed both children as dead. It was Lord Vidor who arranged for Mrs. Renwick to be dismissed from the household the following morning, before she could speak to Constantine. And it was Lord Vidor who, when Constantine's grief spiraled into the abyss, when the Duke stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped recognizing his own servants, quietly petitioned the Court of Chancery to have his nephew declared mentally incompetent, thereby placing the Silverton fortune and estates under the control of a commission of lunacy that Lord Vidor himself intended to dominate. Mrs. Renwick, dismissed and unpaid, had spent 5 months trying to reach someone who would listen. She had written letters that were intercepted. She had attempted to visit the estate and been turned away at the gate. She had, in desperation, taken the one piece of evidence she possessed, the pearl brooch that Lady Sophia had worn at her wedding, and had pressed into Mrs. Renwick's hand on the night she died, whispering, "For the girl, for my girl," and fled south toward London, where she hoped to find a solicitor willing to challenge the commission. She never made it. The blizzard caught her on the moors. She had Pearl. She had kept Pearl hidden for 5 months, feeding her, nursing her, moving from village to village to stay ahead of Lord Vidor's agents. And when the cold and the exhaustion and the miles finally broke her, she stumbled into the ditch outside Thornsby and placed her charge in the arms of the first person who came. The irony is devastating. Mrs. Renwick died less than 3 miles from the Silverton estate, carrying the Duke's living child, while the Duke himself, broken by the lie that both his children were dead, wandered those same moors in the dark. Had she turned north instead of south? Had the blizzard struck an hour later? Had the road been a mile shorter? But those are the mathematics of tragedy, and they do not change. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Why? Why would an uncle do this to his own nephew? What could possibly justify the destruction of a man's mind and the concealment of a living child? The answer is the oldest and ugliest answer in the world: money. Lord Vidor Vane was the second son of the 4th Duke, a man who had lived his entire life in the shadow of a title he could not inherit, spending money he did not earn, accumulating debts he could not pay. The commission of lunacy, had it held, would have placed him in effective control of £38,000 a year. That was the calculation. That was the entire sum of his moral reasoning, his nephew's sanity, his great-niece's life, the death of a loyal servant in a ditch. None of it registered against the weight of £38,000. But what happened next? What Marianne did not know, what the village did not know, what even Lord Aubrey did not yet fully understand, would alter the course of everything. And I promise you, it is worth the wait. Lord Vidor Vane died of apoplexy in February of 1843, 6 weeks after the blizzard, and 1 week before Marianne found the gamekeeper's cottage. He died without knowing that his scheme had already unravelled. He died at his desk in London, red-faced and furious over a dispute with a wine merchant, and the world was marginally improved by his absence from it. But the damage he had done, the commission of lunacy, the buried truth, the Duke's shattered mind, remained. And it was this damage, this intricate architecture of lies and legal manipulation, that Marianne Croft had walked into without knowing it. Constantine had found Marianne in the 2nd week. He had been living on the estate in a way that was more animal than human, sleeping in outbuildings, drinking from streams, eating whatever he could catch or find. His steward, Mr. Pratt, had resigned in December. His brother, Lord Aubrey Vane, was in London trying to unpick the commission of lunacy that their uncle had engineered. The tenants avoided the Duke when they saw him. The gamekeepers reported his movements to Lord Aubrey by letter and otherwise left him alone, because there was nothing else to be done. The law said he was mad. The commission said he was incompetent, and the man himself, vast, silent, feral, gave every appearance of confirming the diagnosis. But he was not mad. Not entirely. Not in the way the commission documents claimed. He was a man whose grief had been so total, so annihilating, that his mind had simply stepped outside the structure of ordinary life and refused to come back. He still thought, he still observed, he still understood in a distant and disconnected way the passage of days and the needs of survival. What he could not do, what the grief would not permit, was engage, speak, connect, exist as a person among persons. The world had taken his wife and his children, and he had withdrawn from the world with the absolute finality of a man boarding up the windows of a house he never intends to inhabit again. And then he found Marianne. Or rather, he found the smoke from her chimney, and then the cottage, and then the woman in the doorway with a baby in her arms. And then he watched, because watching was the only thing he was capable of. And what he watched night after night was a woman talking to the trees as though the trees might answer, telling the darkness about a baby's first smile, about a repaired roof, about a thimble that had belonged to her mother, speaking into the silence with a warmth and a steadiness and a complete absence of fear that reached something in him, some buried, half-dead part of himself that had not yet given up. He began to leave food. Not because he decided to, not because he reasoned through the ethics of intervention. He left food the way a man breathes, because the alternative was intolerable. She was thin, the baby was small, the cottage was cold. He could not let them die. It was the first thing he had been unable to let happen in 7 months, and the inability itself was the beginning of his return. The food became a ritual, a structure. The first structure his ruined mind had been able to hold since August. Find food, prepare it, leave it at the door, retreat, listen to her voice in the evening, return in the dark. And somewhere in that rhythm, in the simple repeated act of keeping another human being alive, something shifted. The boards began to come off the windows. Not all of them, not quickly, but slowly, grudgingly. One by one, the Duke began to let light back in. Mr. Harrow changed things. Mr. Harrow was a land agent, employed, technically, by the Commission to oversee the Silverton tenancies, while the Duke was indisposed. He was a practical man, not unkind, but possessed of the particular obtuseness of someone who sees land as a series of problems to be solved rather than a place where people live. He had heard about the squatter in the gamekeeper's cottage. Of course he had, the tenants talked. And in early March he rode out to assess the situation. He found Marianne in the garden, if you could call it that. A patch of cleared earth where she had begun to plant things, optimistically, against the approach of spring. Pearl was on a blanket in the doorway, kicking at the air. Marianne straightened when she heard the horse and watched him approach with the wary stillness of a woman who has learned that visitors rarely bring good news. "Miss Croft!" He dismounted. He was perhaps 40, well-fed, with the ruddy complexion of a man who spent his days outdoors. "I'm Harrow, land agent for the Silverton estates. I understand you've been living in this cottage." "I have." "It belongs to the estate. You've no lease, no arrangement." "No." "Then I must ask you to vacate. The Commission—" "I understand," Marianne said. She did not argue. She did not plead. She stood there with dirt on her hands and the March wind pulling at her hair, and looked at him with an expression that was neither hostile nor submissive, but simply, quietly, immovable. "I will leave when I have somewhere to go. I have a child." Harrow looked at Pearl. Something in his face softened. Just slightly, just for a moment. And then the professional mask reassembled itself. "I'll give you a fortnight, but the cottage must be cleared." He left. Marianne sat down on the step and held Pearl and said nothing for a long time. Then she looked at the tree line and said, very quietly, "I think our time here is ending." The trees said nothing. But that night the food that appeared at the door was more than usual. A haunch of venison, a loaf of bread so fresh the crust was still warm, 3 apples, and a small bundle of wildflowers. Heather and early violets, tied with a strip of cloth. Marianne held the flowers and looked at them and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since the night of the blizzard. Something dangerous, something that made her chest ache and her eyes sting, and her practical, sensible, carefully constructed defenses begin, very slightly, to crack. She put the flowers in a jar of water on the windowsill. She did not speak to the tree line that night. She sat in the doorway in silence, and the silence was different from all the silences that had come before, because it was full. Harrow returned 5 days later, not with paperwork this time, not yet, but with a surveyor's assistant, a thin young man who trailed behind him with a measuring chain and a leather notebook, and the nervous energy of someone who would rather be anywhere else on earth. Harrow rode slowly around the cottage, assessing the roof, the walls, the cleared garden, the stack of firewood that was far too neatly arranged to have been gathered by a woman alone. He noted the quality of the repairs, the mud and straw filling in the walls, the new hearthstone, the iron bolt on the door that had clearly been fitted with skill. "Someone's been helping you," he said, not unkindly, but with the careful attention of a man whose professional instincts were telling him that the situation was more complicated than a simple squatter. "I manage," Marianne said. He studied her for a moment. Then he looked at the tree line. A long, slow look, as though he too could feel the weight of something watching from between the oaks, and something crossed his face that Marianne could not quite read. Uncertainty, perhaps unease. He mounted his horse and left without another word, the surveyor's assistant hurrying behind him. But the third visit was different. The third time, Harrow came with documents. Formal notice of eviction, stamped with the commission's seal, folded and sealed with red wax. He was apologetic in the distracted way of a man who is sorry about a problem but not sorry enough to solve it. He dismounted, hitched his horse to the fence post, and walked to the cottage door with the heavy tread of a man performing a duty he wished he could avoid. He knocked. Marianne opened it. Pearl was on her, hip gnawing a crust of bread. Harrow held out the papers and began to speak. "Miss Croft, I have here a formal notice of eviction issued under the authority of the Silverton Commission. The cottage and surrounding land are estate property and—" "I can read," Marianne said quietly. He paused. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. He held the papers out further, as though the act of her taking them would absolve him of something. Marianne did not take them. She stood in the doorway with the March wind at her back, and Pearl's small hand curled around the collar of her dress, and she looked at Mr. Harrow, the way she had looked at the vicar and the church hall and the draper's wife, with the patient, unblinking steadiness of a woman who has been told to leave before and is still, inexplicably, standing. "The commission requires vacant possession within 14 days, Harrow continued. His voice had taken on the mechanical quality of a man reciting words he does not believe. "Failure to comply may result in—" Pearl began to cry. Not loudly, a thin, unhappy sound, the sound of a baby who has sensed the tension in the arms holding her and does not like it. Marianne shifted her weight. She pressed her lips to the top of Pearl's head. She said nothing. Harrow looked at the baby. He looked at the moor. Empty, vast, offering nothing. He looked at the papers in his hand. And for a moment his professional mask slipped entirely. and what was underneath was something that looked very much like shame. "Miss Croft," he said more quietly, "is there truly no one who can—" And then the tree line moved. That is the only way to describe it. The trees did not physically rearrange themselves, but the darkness between them shifted, thickened, and produced the figure of a man so large and so completely, terrifyingly present that Mr. Harrow's horse screamed and bolted sideways, nearly pulling the hitching post out of the ground. Constantine Vane stepped out of the trees. He was 40 yards away. He said nothing. He did nothing. He simply stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at Mr. Harrow with those grey, glacial, perfectly lucid eyes. And Harrow, who had never met the Duke, who had only ever seen the signature on old documents, understood instantly and viscerally exactly who was standing there. The colour left his face. He dropped the eviction papers. He said, "Your Grace," in a voice that had gone thin and breathless, and then he backed toward his horse with the careful, measured steps of a man retreating from a predator who has not yet decided whether to strike. He mounted. He rode. He did not come back. Marianne turned to look at the Duke. He was already retreating, already fading back into the trees with that unnatural silence, that ability to dissolve into the landscape as though he were made of it. But for one moment, no more than 3 or 4 seconds, their eyes met across the clearing, and Marianne saw something in his face that had not been there before. Not warmth exactly, not kindness. Something more deliberate, more intentional. A decision. He had made a decision. He was not going to let them take her. "Can I tell you something?" This is one of those moments in a story where I have to put down my pen and simply sit with it. Because what is happening here is not a rescue. It is not a man swooping in to save a woman. It is something far more rare and far more powerful. 2 people, both destroyed by the world in different ways, both surviving on the thinnest of margins, choosing each other without a single word being exchanged. She talks to the trees. He leaves flowers at her door. And in the space between those gestures, in the silence, in the darkness, in the cold, empty moor, something is growing that neither of them can name. That is what love looks like before it has a language, and it is the most beautiful thing I know. It was 4 days after Harrow's second visit that the men came. 3 of them, as we have already seen, 2 hired thugs, and Sir Aldous Pembroke himself, who had not forgotten Marianne's defiance in the church hall, and who had spent 2 months nursing his wounded authority into something sharp and vindictive. And it was that night, the night of the bolted door and the breaking brackets and the single word spoken from the darkness, that Constantine Vane came back to himself. Not completely, not all at once. But the man who walked out of those trees was not the same creature who had been leaving rabbits on a doorstep. He was something harder, something with edges, something that remembered what it was like to be a duke and understood, with the cold clarity that grief sometimes produces, that the people who had tried to destroy him, his uncle, the commission, the magistrate, had also tried to destroy this woman who had saved his child, who had talked to the trees when no one else in the world would have talked to him, who had stood alone on the moors with nothing but a sewing needle and a mother's thimble and kept his daughter alive through a winter that should have killed them both. He would not let them touch her. He would not let them touch Pearl. And the realization, arriving like a thunderclap in a mind that had been silent for 7 months, was the thing that finally, irrevocably, woke him up. After the men fled and Pearl recognized him, and he knelt in the doorway with his daughter in his arms, something else happened. Something quieter, but no less significant. Marianne showed him the brooch. She brought it out from the small tin box where she kept her mother's thimble and the few shillings she had saved, and she held it in her palm. The pearl set in tarnished silver, small and unassuming, and worth more than either of them knew. "The woman in the snow," Marianne said. "She had this pinned inside her cloak. She said the baby's name was Pearl. She was trying to tell me something else, but the wind—" Or she could not finish. Constantine looked at the brooch. He did not take it. He simply stared at it with an expression that Marianne had never seen on a human face. The expression of a man watching a ghost become solid. He reached out and touched it with one finger, just the pad of his finger against the pearl's smooth surface, and his hand shook so violently that for a moment Marianne thought he was having a seizure. "It was my wife's," he said. His voice was still raw, still damaged by months of silence, but the words were clear. "She wore it the day we married. Then this child is mine." He looked at Pearl, who was asleep against his chest with the serene indifference of a baby who has decided that the safest place in the world is exactly where she is. "She was born in August. I was told she was dead. I was told both of them. I was told—" He stopped. His jaw locked. The grief was still there. Enormous. Tidal. Capable of drowning him. But it was no longer the only thing inside him. There was rage now. Cold, clean, structural rage. The kind of rage that does not destroy. It builds. It assembles. It plans. "Who told you?" Marianne asked. "My uncle. The physician. The entire household, because my uncle controlled the entire household. He wanted me broken. He wanted the commission. He wanted the money." "And the woman in the snow?" "Mrs. Renwick, my wife's attendant. She must have known. She must have taken Pearl and run." "She ran 5 months in winter with a newborn," Marianne said quietly. "She made it to within 3 miles of your gate." Constantine closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were dry. Everything in them had been converted to purpose. "I need to find my brother," he said, and then he did something that surprised her. He looked at her, directly, fully, without the sideways half-hidden glances from the tree-line, and said, "Will you stay?" "Here, in the cottage? Will you stay until I come back?" "Yes." "I will send provisions, properly. Not—" He gestured vaguely at the trees, and for one moment the ghost of something that might have been embarrassment crossed his ruined face. "Not like before." "I liked before," Marianne said, and then, because she could not help herself, "The flowers were kind." He looked at her, that look again, the one that had no name, the one that was too large for the language available to it. "You talk to me," he said, "every night. You talk to the trees." "I talk to you." "I know." His voice was very quiet. "It was the only thing that kept me here." He left before dawn. Marianne stood in the doorway and watched him walk across the moor. A tall, straight figure moving through the grey half-light with a purpose she had not seen in him before. And she held Pearl against her chest and thought, "I do not know what is happening. I do not know what this is. But I am not going to look away from it." Now to understand what happened next, and what it meant for the future of the Silverton dukedom, for Pearl, for Marianne, and for every person who had conspired to destroy them, we must understand the extraordinary legal and political power that a duke wielded in 1843 England. Because when Constantine Vane walked off that moor and back into the world, he carried with him a force that few people in the modern age can truly comprehend. A duke was not merely wealthy. A duke was not merely titled. A duke was, in practical terms, a sovereign power operating within the framework of the state. The Duke of Silverton controlled £38,000 per annum, at a time when a labourer earned perhaps £30 a year and a comfortable gentleman might live well on 500. His estates spanned 3 counties. His tenants numbered in the thousands. He held a seat in the House of Lords by birthright. His word could make or break a family. His displeasure could render a man unemployable across entire regions of England. And his legal resources, the solicitors, the barristers, the connections in Chancery and Parliament and the Privy Council, were functionally unlimited. Lord Vidor Vane had understood this power, which was precisely why he had moved to neutralize it through the Commission of Lunacy. A mad duke was a powerless duke, but a duke who had recovered his faculties, a duke who had evidence of fraud, of conspiracy, of the abduction and concealment of a legitimate heir, was the most dangerous thing in England. Constantine walked for 2 days. He walked to the nearest posting inn, 20 miles south, where the innkeeper, who did not recognize the skeletal, wild-haired figure as the Duke of Silverton, gave him paper and ink in exchange for a gold signet ring that Constantine pulled from a pocket so deep in his coat that it had survived 7 months of living rough. He wrote 2 letters. The first was to Lord Aubrey Vane at his London address. The second was to Harding, the Silverton family's solicitors, in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Both letters said, in essence, the same thing. I am awake. Come to me. Bring everything. Lord Aubrey arrived in Yorkshire within the week, travelling by post-chaise at a speed that nearly killed 2 horses and 1 postilion. He was 28, fair-haired, quick-minded, and had spent the past 7 months engaged in a legal battle against their uncle's commission that had consumed every penny of his personal income and most of his sanity. He found his brother at the posting inn, bathed and shaved and dressed in borrowed clothes that did not fit, sitting by the fire with a stack of documents and a pot of tea and eyes that were, for the first time in 7 months, entirely present. "You look terrible," Aubrey said. "You look worse," Constantine replied, and that was the extent of their emotional reunion, because the Vane brothers did not traffic in sentiment when there was work to be done. Constantine told him everything. The baby, Mrs. Renwick, the brooch, the woman in the cottage who had kept Pearl alive. Aubrey listened without interrupting, a skill he had refined during months of legal argument. And when Constantine was finished, he said 2 things. First, the commission can be dissolved in a fortnight if you submit to examination by 3 physicians of your choosing. I have the names ready. I have had them ready since October. Second, and the woman? Constantine said nothing. Aubrey, who was not a fool, and who knew his brother better than any person alive, let it pass. There would be time for that question later. The physicians came. They examined. They found the Duke of Silverton to be gaunt, undernourished, and bearing the physical marks of 7 months of rough living, but cognitively sharp, emotionally coherent, and legally competent. The Commission of Lunacy was dissolved on the 4th of April, 1843. On the 5th of April, the Duke of Silverton walked into the offices of Harding in Lincoln's Inn Fields, dressed in clothes that fit and shoes that did not leak, and spent 6 hours systematically dismantling the legal architecture that his dead uncle had constructed. Every document was examined, every transaction was traced, every payment, every bribe, every intercepted letter was identified, catalogued, and prepared for presentation to the Court of Chancery. Pearl's identity was confirmed through the brooch, through Mrs. Renwick's employment records, through the testimony of 2 servants who had been present at the birth, and who, when confronted with the Duke's return and the prospect of perjury charges, suddenly remembered details that Lord Vidor's money had encouraged them to forget. Now we must speak briefly about what this meant for Pearl in the eyes of the law, because the rights of a noble heir, particularly a female heir to a dukedom, were governed by rules of extraordinary complexity and consequence. Pearl was, under the laws of primogeniture, the Duke's legitimate daughter, the surviving child of a lawful marriage, born in the family seat, her existence attested to by witnesses and physical evidence. She could not inherit the dukedom itself, that required a male heir, and the laws governing the descent of English peerages were absolute on this point, but she was entitled to far more than the law typically afforded a woman. She could inherit her mother's marriage settlement, which in the case of Lady Sophia Vane was substantial, a jointure of £4,000 per annum secured against the Silverton estates. She could inherit personal property. She could receive any provision the Duke chose to make for her in his will or by deed of settlement, and crucially, her existence as a legitimate heir altered the legal landscape of the entire Silverton succession. If Constantine died without a male heir, the dukedom would pass to Aubrey. But Pearl's survival, her documented existence, her proof of life, demolished the entire foundation of Lord Vidor's scheme. The commission of lunacy had been justified in part by the argument that the Duke, childless, broken, incapable, had no reason to recover and no heir whose interests required protection. Pearl's existence made that argument a lie, and in the courts of Chancery, where the machinery of English law ground slowly, but with devastating finality, a lie was the most dangerous thing of all. And this brings us, at last, to the separation, because Constantine did not go back to the cottage, not immediately, not the way Marianne expected, not the way she hoped. He sent provisions, as he had promised. A cart arrived at the gamekeeper's cottage 3 days after his departure, loaded with food, firewood, blankets, and a letter. Not from Constantine, but from Lord Aubrey, written in a neat, careful hand, explaining that the Duke was in London attending to urgent legal matters, and that Miss Croft was to remain in the cottage with all necessities provided for as long as required. The letter was polite, professional, and contained not a single word of personal feeling. Marianne read it twice. She folded it. She put it in the tin box with the brooch and the thimble, and she sat in the doorway with Pearl on her lap and watched the moor darken toward evening and said nothing to the trees, because the trees were empty now and she knew it. Weeks passed. The provisions came regularly, delivered by a silent, efficient manservant who answered none of her questions and departed immediately after unloading the cart. April turned to May. The moor erupted in green. The heather began to bud. Pearl grew astonishingly, visibly, day by day, and began to do things that made Marianne laugh despite everything. Grabbing at the cat that had appeared from somewhere and taken up residence in the cottage, shrieking, with delight at butterflies, discovering that her own foot was a source of endless fascination. And Marianne, practical, steady, immovable Marianne, began to understand something about herself that she had been avoiding for weeks. She missed him. Not the provider, not the protector, not the title or the wealth or the power. Him. The shape in the tree line, the footprints in the frost, the flowers tied with a strip of cloth, the raw, ruined voice saying, "You talk to me," as though those conversations in the dark, her voice and his silence, had been the most important thing that had ever happened to him. She was in love with him. She had been for some time. Perhaps since the night he spoke his first word in 7 months to drive away the men who came for Pearl. Perhaps since the morning she found the wildflowers. Perhaps since before that, since the first rabbit on the doorstep, since the first silence that felt like listening, since the first night she sat in the doorway and spoke to the darkness and felt, impossibly, that the darkness was glad she was there. She named it. Sitting on the step of the gamekeeper's cottage with the May sun warm on her face and Pearl sleeping in the crook of her arm, she named it with the brutal honesty of a woman who has never been able to afford self-deception. She was in love with the Duke of Silverton, She was in love with a man she had never had a proper conversation with, a man who had spent months watching her from the trees, a man whose grief was so vast it had unmade him, a man who now lived in a world of solicitors and parliament and power that she could not enter and had no right to claim. And she understood, with the same pragmatism that had carried her through the blizzard and the exile and the months alone, that the correct thing to do was nothing. He had a child to reclaim, a name to restore, a world to rebuild. She was a seamstress from Thornsby, with dirt under her nails and no family, and a reputation that the village had destroyed before she'd even left it. Whatever had passed between them on the moor, the food, the flowers, the silence that felt like speaking, it belonged to the moor. It did not belong to the world he was returning to. She would not go to London. She would not present herself at his door. She would not do anything that could be interpreted as a woman reaching above her station to claim a man who had shown her kindness in extraordinary circumstances. She knew what that looked like. She knew what people would say, and she would not give them the satisfaction. Lord Aubrey wrote again in May. A longer letter this time, more personal. The commission was dissolved. Pearl's identity was confirmed. Legal proceedings had been initiated against several persons involved in Lord Vidor's conspiracy. The Duke was recovering well. He had asked, and here Aubrey's handwriting became slightly less tidy, as though he were choosing his words with unusual care. He had asked Lord Aubrey to inquire whether Miss Croft might consider relocating to more comfortable lodgings in the market town of Crestwick, 12 miles south, at the Duke's expense until such time as arrangements could be made. Arrangements. That word. So carefully chosen, so deliberately vague. Marianne wrote back. A brief note in her best hand. She thanked Lord Aubrey for his kindness. She accepted the offer of lodgings in Crestwick. She asked him to convey her regards to the Duke and her happiness at Pearl's formal recognition. She said nothing else. She asked for nothing. She expected nothing. She moved to Crestwick in late May. The lodgings were a small but comfortable set of rooms above a bookseller's shop. Chosen, she suspected, by someone who knew she liked to read, though she could not imagine how anyone could know that about her unless they had been paying very close attention indeed. The rooms were warm, clean, and mercifully free of the particular damp that had characterized the gamekeeper's cottage. There was a bed with actual sheets, a kitchen with a proper stove, a window that looked out onto the market square, where on Wednesdays and Saturdays the farmers brought their goods, and the town came alive with the kind of ordinary human bustle that Marianne had not experienced in months. She should have been content. She was safe. She was housed. She was fed. Pearl was thriving. The nightmare of the moor was over. She was not content. She was miserable in a way that she had no right to be and could not explain to anyone, least of all herself. She lay awake at night and listened to the silence of Crestwick, the ordinary silence of a market town, full of distant sounds, dogs barking, carts on cobblestones, the church clock striking the hours. And it was wrong. It was the wrong silence. It was the absence of wind on the moor, and the creak of the cottage door, and the particular quality of quiet that meant someone was standing in the darkness, watching, listening, keeping her alive. She was in love with him. She had named it, and naming it had not made it smaller. It had made it enormous. She found herself doing things that made no sense. Walking to the edge of town in the evening and standing at the place where the road curved north toward the moors, as though the wind from that direction might carry something of him. Holding Pearl close and breathing in the scent of her hair, milk and warmth and clean linen, and thinking, he is missing this. He is missing the way she grabs at the light through the window. He is missing the sound she makes when she is happy, which is like a bird and a bell and a laugh all at once. She woke in the night and reached for something that was not there, and lay in the dark with her hand on the empty pillow and thought, "This is what it feels like. This is what it costs to love a man who does not know you love him." She sewed. She had taken her kit to Crestwick and found small commissions. A hem for the bookseller's wife, a collar for the draper's daughter. Nothing like the fine work she was capable of, but enough to fill the hours and give her hand something to do while her mind circled the same impossible orbit. She sewed in the window seat where the light was good, and sometimes she looked up and expected to see the tree line, and instead there was only the market square, and the disappointment was so sharp it felt physical. Pearl missed him too. Or perhaps that was Marianne reading her own grief onto the child. But there were evenings when Pearl turned toward the door of their rooms with that alert, expectant expression, the one she had worn in the cottage doorway when the presence in the trees was near, and when no one came, something in her small face would shift, and she would turn back to Marianne with a look that was, impossibly, patient, as though she were waiting, as though she understood. But I think you're wondering what was happening on the other side of this distance, and this is the part that nearly broke me to write. Constantine was not fine. He was functional. That was what mattered to the world. He attended meetings. He gave instructions to solicitors. He sat through medical examinations with cold, patient tolerance. He held Pearl. When she was brought to him from the nurse he had hired, a kind woman from Somerset who was competent, but who was not Marianne. And he held her with the careful, fierce tenderness of a man who understands that the universe has given him something he did not deserve and might, at any moment, take it back. But Lord Aubrey, who lived in the London townhouse and watched his brother every day, knew. He knew because of the things Constantine did when he thought no one was watching. The way he stood at the study window at dawn, facing north, always toward Yorkshire, with a stillness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with containment. The way he held Pearl in the evening and spoke to her in a low murmur that Aubrey could never quite hear from the hallway, but that sounded from the cadence and the pauses like a conversation with someone who was not in the room. The way he refused to eat certain foods, coarse dark bread, honey, apples, as though they belonged to another life that he could not bear to touch. And Aubrey knew because he found the letters, not one or two, but a stack, written in Constantine's sharp, angular hand on good paper, sealed with the Silverton crest, addressed to Miss M. Croft, gamekeeper's cottage, Silverton estate, and every single one of them unsent. They sat in the drawer of Constantine's desk, growing thicker by the week. Aubrey counted them once when Constantine was at the solicitor's. 14. 14 letters in 6 weeks. He never opened them. He never asked about them. He never said a word, because some things between brothers do not require words. But he understood what they meant. They meant that Constantine Vane, who had rebuilt himself from the ground up, who had clawed his way back from madness through sheer savage will, who had dismantled a fraudulent commission and recovered his child and restored his name, this same man could not bring himself to post a letter to the woman who had saved him, because the letter would require a response. And the response might be the wrong one. He also knew because of the question. Constantine asked it once, only once, on a night in late April, when they were sitting in the study and the fire was low and the silence had gone on long enough to become a conversation of its own. "Has she asked for anything?" Constantine said. His voice was casual. His hand holding the brandy glass was not. "No," Aubrey said, "nothing." Constantine nodded. He looked at the fire. His jaw tightened, a fractional movement barely visible, but Aubrey saw it, and what it cost, and he did not ask again. But Aubrey, who was more perceptive than his brother gave him credit for, and who had spent enough time reading Marianne's carefully composed letters to recognize the writing of a woman who was saying exactly what she meant and nothing more, understood something that Constantine, for all his intelligence, could not see. She was not asking for anything because she believed she had no right to ask, and he was not going because he believed she did not want him to come. They were two people separated by a distance that had nothing to do with miles and everything to do with the particular devastating modesty of people who have been taught by life to expect nothing. It was Aubrey who acted, quietly, without telling Constantine. He wrote to Marianne in early June, a short letter, personal rather than formal, asking how she was settling in Crestwick and whether there was anything she needed. And at the bottom of the letter, in a postscript that appeared casual but was anything but, he wrote, "My brother asks after you more often than he knows. I thought you should be aware of that." Marianne read the postscript 7 times. She put the letter in the tin box. She did not reply. In this era, it is worth noting, and this is the 5th thing I want you to understand about the world Marianne inhabited. The legal landscape for women was beginning, very slowly, to shift. The Married Women's Property Act would not be passed until 1870, nearly 30 years from the events of this story. But the conversations that led to that act were already happening in 1843. In pamphlets, in drawing rooms, in the quiet, persistent advocacy of women like Caroline Norton, whose public battle over custody of her own children had exposed the brutal reality of coverture law to the nation's attention. The world Marianne lived in was one where a woman who married surrendered everything, her property, her earnings, her legal identity, to her husband. But it was also a world where the first cracks in that system were beginning to show. The question of what a woman was entitled to, what she could own, what she could keep, what choices she had a right to make, was no longer a settled matter. It was, for the first time in centuries, a question. And Marianne, sitting in her rooms in Crestwick with her practical mind and her broken heart, was asking herself that very question, not in political terms, but in personal ones. What did she have a right to want? What did she have a right to claim? Was it possible that a seamstress from Thornsby could look at a duke and say, "I choose you"? Not because of your title or your wealth or your power, but because you left me flowers in the dark, and your silence felt like the safest place I have ever been. She did not know, and so she did nothing, and the weeks passed, and the ache did not diminish. Mr. Aldgate Foss arrived in Crestwick in early June. He was a solicitor, youngish, perhaps 30, neatly dressed, with pleasant features and the slightly over-eager manner of a professional man who has recently moved to a new town and is still building his reputation. He had set up offices on the high street, and within a fortnight he was handling leases and wills and minor disputes with a competence that endeared him to the local population. He noticed Marianne almost immediately. This was not surprising. Crestwick was a small town, and a young woman living alone above the bookseller's shop with no apparent husband or family was, by the standards of rural England, remarkable. The first approach came on a Wednesday, market day, when Marianne was examining a bolt of cotton at the draper's stall and calculating whether she could afford enough for a summer dress for Pearl. Foss appeared beside her with the smooth timing of a man who has been watching for an opportunity. "Miss Croft, is it not? I believe we have a mutual acquaintance, Mr. Hadley at the bookseller's." "We do," Marianne said. She did not encourage. She did not discourage. She answered the question and turned back to the cotton. But Foss was not easily deflected. He was pleasant. He was persistent. He fell into step beside her as she walked through the market carrying her basket when she did not ask him to, offering observations about the town that were designed to demonstrate his education and his prospects. He was, Marianne recognized, performing. The performance of an eligible man for a woman he considered available. The second approach came on a Saturday. Foss appeared at the bookseller's door with a volume tucked under his arm. A collection of poetry that he presented to Marianne with a small bow, and an explanation that he had noticed her reading in the window and thought she might enjoy it. The book was well chosen. That was the unsettling part. He had been paying attention. Not in the way that Constantine had paid attention, which was silent and total and asked for nothing in return, but in the calculated way of a man building a case. Evidence of compatibility, proof of thoughtfulness, the careful architecture of courtship. Marianne thanked him. She accepted the book. She read it that evening. It was good, she had to admit. And she felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. And the absence of feeling was itself a feeling, because it told her, with brutal clarity, exactly what she already knew. She was not available. Her heart had been claimed months ago by a man who left rabbits at her door and flowers tied with strips of cloth, and who had said her name in a market square as though it were the most important word in the English language, even though that had not happened yet, even though she did not know it was coming, even though she was sitting in her room above the bookseller's shop, holding a book of poetry given to her by the wrong man and aching for the right one. The third approach, the one that mattered, came on the Tuesday. Foss found her at the bread stall and positioned himself beside her with the easy familiarity of a man who had decided that proximity equaled progress. He was telling her about a property he had been retained to manage, a small farm on the edge of town, good land, the kind of place a man might raise a family. And the subtext was so transparent that even the bread seller was watching with interest. Marianne was listening. Not because she was interested, but because she was polite, and because the alternative, telling this decent, harmless, entirely wrong man that she was in love with someone who might never come for her, was a cruelty she could not bring herself to perform. And that was when she heard the hooves. Not the placid clop of a cart horse, the rapid, percussive strike of a horse being ridden hard. She turned. Constantine Vane came down the high street of Crestwick on a black horse, and the town, which had never seen its local duke, which knew him only as a rumour and a name on legal documents, stopped. Every conversation halted. Every face turned. Because the man on that horse was not the skeletal wreck who had stumbled out of the moors 3 months ago. He was shaved. He was dressed. He was riding with the controlled, devastating elegance of a man who had been born on horseback. And his face, that hard, angular, unreadable face, was set with an expression that Marianne had seen only once before, on the night he stepped out of the tree line to confront Sir Aldous Pembroke. The expression of a man who has made a decision and will not be stopped. He saw her. She was standing by the bread stall with her basket in her hand, and the June sun in her hair, and an expression on her face that she would later be embarrassed about, because it was not composed or dignified or careful. It was naked. It was everything she had been holding back for 3 months. The longing, the hope, the terror that he had come for Pearl and not for her, written across her. Features with the transparency of a woman who has been caught off guard by the only thing she has ever wanted. And then he saw Foss, standing beside her, close enough to be familiar, close enough to suggest a history, a claim, a presence in her life that was ongoing and established. The temperature in the market square dropped. Constantine reined the horse to a halt. He dismounted. He did not look at Foss. Not yet, not directly, but Marianne could feel the awareness radiating from him like heat from a forge. He was cataloguing, assessing, determining the threat. and the cold, territorial fury that settled over his features was so total, so absolute, that Mr. Foss, who did not know who this man was, who had never seen a duke in his life, who had no framework for understanding the kind of power that was currently being aimed at him like a cannon, took an involuntary step backward. "Your Grace," Marianne said. Her voice was steady. She was amazed by this, because her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. "Miss Croft!" He crossed the square. His boots struck the cobblestones with the measured precision of a man who is exercising significant self-control. He stopped in front of her. He did not touch her. He looked at Foss. "Who is this?" 2 words, spoken with the courtesy of a drawing room and the temperature of a January night on the moors. "This is Mr. Foss," Marianne said. "He is a solicitor in Crestwick. Mr. Foss, this is the Duke of Silverton." Foss went white. He had not known. How could he have known? He was new in town, new to the county, new to the complex web of local power that governed every interaction in rural England. He had been paying attention to a woman he found attractive, and he had walked directly into the sightline of one of the most powerful men in the country. "Your Grace," Foss said. His voice was admirably steady, all things considered. "It is an honor." Constantine did not acknowledge this. He looked at Marianne. The cold fury was still there, but beneath it, visible only to her, because she had spent weeks learning to read him through silence and shadow and the quality of his stillness, something else, something vulnerable, something that was asking a question he could not bring himself to speak. "Mr. Foss," Marianne said, turning to the solicitor with the clear, direct gaze that was entirely her own and belonged to no man, "thank you for your company. You may go." She said it plainly, without cruelty, without drama, without the theatrical emphasis of a woman performing for an audience. She said it the way she said everything, honestly, simply, as a statement of fact. Mr. Foss was dismissed. Not because a duke demanded it, but because Marianne Croft had decided. Foss left. He gathered what remained of his dignity. He bowed to the duke, and he walked away across the market square with the slightly too quick steps of a man who understands that he has been outclassed in every possible dimension. Constantine watched him go. Then he looked at Marianne. "He was courting you," he said, not a question. "He was trying to. And you—" "I was buying bread, Your Grace." Something happened to his face. That crack again. The one she had first seen in the doorway of the cottage. The one that appeared when his armor shifted and the man underneath became briefly, dangerously visible. It was not quite a smile. It was the place where a smile would be, if he remembered how. "I brought something," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a small object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it with hands that were steadier than they had been in March. Cleaner, too, the nails trimmed, the old scars fading. And held it out to her. The pearl brooch. But not as she had last seen it. The tarnish was gone. The silver gleamed. The setting had been repaired. Reset, she could see, by a craftsman of extraordinary skill. And around the pearl, where there had been only a simple bezel before, there was now a ring of tiny diamonds that caught the June sun and scattered light across her palm. It was the same brooch, and it was not the same brooch. It had been remade, like him, like her, like everything between them. Marianne stared at it. The June breeze caught the edge of her hair and moved it across her face, and she did not push it away because her hands had gone very still and her breath had gone very shallow, and she was suddenly, terrifyingly aware that whatever he said next would determine the shape of the rest of her life. "It was my wife's," he said. "She would have wanted—" He stopped, swallowed. The muscle in his jaw worked. I had it repaired. For you. For me? Will you marry me? The market square was very quiet. A pigeon landed on the cobblestones near Marianne's feet. The church clock began to strike noon. 12 chimes, slow and deep, marking the middle of a day that had, without warning, become the most important day of her life. She could smell the bread in her basket. She could feel the warmth of the sun on the back of her neck. She could hear from somewhere behind her the sound of Crestwick going about its business, carts and voices and the ordinary machinery of a world that did not yet understand that everything in it had just changed. "You don't know me," she said. "We have never had a proper conversation." "We had conversations every night for 2 months. I talked. You listened. That is a conversation, Marianne." It was the first time he had used her name. It landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward in rings, changing the shape of everything it touched. "The only real conversation I have had in years. I am a seamstress. I know what you are." He took a step closer, not threatening, not demanding, but deliberate, close enough that she could smell him. Not sandalwood and cologne, not the groomed scent of a London gentleman, but clean wool and horse and cold air, the scent of a man who had ridden 60 miles in a day because he could not wait another hour. "You are the woman who walked into a blizzard for a stranger's child. You are the woman who defied a village. You are the woman who talked to me in the dark when I had forgotten how to be human. I know exactly what you are. Society will do whatever I tell it to do." His voice had gone quiet, very quiet. The voice of a man who is not making a speech, but making a vow. "You saved my child. You saved me. I have spent 3 months in London trying to rebuild my life, and every day I sat at my desk and thought about the moor and the cottage and your voice in the dark, and I understood that there is nothing in London, nothing in Parliament, nothing in my estates, nothing in the entire structure of my existence that matters as much as being wherever you are. Constantine, I wrote you 14 letters, Michel said, and for the first time his voice cracked. Not much, just a hairline fracture in that iron control. "I wrote them and I sealed them and I put them in a drawer and I could not send them because I was afraid. I, who have faced down Parliament and solicitors and my uncle's entire conspiracy. I was afraid that you would write back and say thank you and nothing more. Because that is what you do, Marianne. You endure, you accept, you expect nothing, and I cannot—" His jaw locked. He breathed. "I cannot let you expect nothing from me." Marianne's hand rose to her mouth. She did not will it there. It simply went, the way a hand goes to a wound instinctively, to hold in what is threatening to spill out. Because the 14 letters changed everything. They rearranged the entire geography of the past 3 months. Every night she had lain awake in Crestwick, aching for him. He had been sitting at a desk in London, writing to her and not sending it. Every silence she had, interpreted as indifference, had been, in fact, its opposite. He had not stayed away because he did not want her. He had stayed away because he wanted her so much that the possibility of her not wanting him back was more than he could risk. All those weeks, all that careful, dignified, devastating restraint on both sides, because two people who had been taught by life to expect nothing had been too afraid to ask for everything. Her eyes were wet. She did not care. Let the bread seller see. Let the whole of Crestwick see. Say yes. He was not commanding. For once the Duke was not commanding, he was asking. With those grey eyes and those shaking hands and that hard, wounded, extraordinary face, he was asking her, a seamstress from Thornsby, a woman who had been cast out by her own village, a woman who talked to trees, to take him. Yes, Marianne said. Her voice was thick and unsteady, and entirely, magnificently sure. Of course, yes. She took the brooch. He did not kiss her. Not there, not in the market square, not in front of the entire town of Crestwick, but he took her hand. He held it. And the look on his face in that moment was the look of a man who has walked through 7 months of darkness and found, on the other side, the only light that matters. Now, there was still the matter of Sir Aldous Pembroke. I have to tell you, this next part is one of my favourites, because up to this point we have watched Marianne suffer. We have watched Constantine suffer. We have watched good people endure terrible things at the hands of a corrupt system. And now we get to watch the system break. Sir Aldous was summoned to Silverton Castle in July. Not invited, summoned. The distinction is important because in the hierarchy of aristocratic power, a duke does not invite a village magistrate. He issues a command. And Sir Aldous, who had spent the past 6 months believing that his authority over Thornsby was unassailable, that the Mad Duke would never recover, that the Commission of Lunacy would protect him from consequences, received the summons with the first stirring of genuine fear he had experienced since the night on the moor when Constantine had stepped out of the darkness and said, "Leave." He came because he had no choice. When a duke summons, you attend. That is not a custom or a courtesy. It is the fundamental operating principle of English aristocratic power. Silverton Castle was not what Sir Aldous expected. He had imagined decay, the crumbling estate of a mad recluse, ill-maintained and understaffed. What he found was a fortress. 60 servants in livery, grounds immaculate, the great hall lit by 100 candles, the table set with silver, the duke seated at its head like a monarch receiving a supplicant. Constantine was dressed in black. Not mourning, he had worn mourning for 11 months and would not wear it again, but the severe, unadorned black of a man who does not need ornamentation to convey power. His hair was cut short, his jaw was clean-shaven. His eyes in the candlelight were the grey of a January sky just before the snow comes. Beside him sat Marianne, and in Marianne's lap sat Pearl, nearly 8 months old now, round-faced and bright-eyed and possessed of the particular fearless curiosity that characterized both her parents. Lord Aubrey stood behind them. And behind Lord Aubrey, arranged in a precise semicircle like the chorus of a very expensive opera, stood 3 solicitors from Harding and Harding, 2 barristers from Lincoln's Inn, and a representative of the Lord Chancellor's office. Sir Aldous Pembroke walked into this room and understood immediately and completely that he was ruined. Sir Aldous. Constantine did not stand. He did not offer his hand. He looked at the magistrate the way a surgeon looks at an amputation, with clinical precision and not a trace of sentiment. "Please sit." Sir Aldous sat. His legs, it seemed, had made the decision for him. "You came to a cottage on my estate in March," Constantine said. "You brought 2 men with you. You attempted to seize a child, my child, as it happens, though you did not know that, from a woman who was sheltering there under my protection." "Your Grace, I was acting on the authority of the parish." "You were acting on the authority of your own ambition and the late Lord Vane's money." Constantine's voice had not risen. It was, if anything, quieter than before. "We have the documents, Sir Aldous, all of them, every payment my uncle made to you, every letter you wrote confirming that the commission was proceeding according to plan, every instruction you received regarding the suppression of inquiries into Pearl's survival." The colour left Sir Aldous' face in stages, like water draining from a basin. "You did not know about the child initially." "I believe that. You are corrupt, but you are not imaginative enough for that particular cruelty. That was my uncle's work, but you knew about the commission. You knew it was fraudulent. You profited from it. Your magistrate's fees doubled in the months following my incapacitation, and the coincidence does not require a mathematician to explain." "Your Grace." "I am not finished." Constantine leaned forward, just slightly, just enough to close the distance between them by a foot, and in that foot Sir Aldous saw the full and terrible weight of ducal authority. Not the performative kind, not the social kind, but the real kind. The kind that could destroy a man as thoroughly and permanently as fire. "The boundary commission for Thornsby parish has been reviewed," Constantine continued. "An error has been discovered. It appears that the western edge of the parish, which includes, I am told, the entirety of your personal estate, falls within the Silverton lands. The survey from 1798 was regrettably inaccurate. The corrected survey, completed last month by a firm of unimpeachable reputation, places your home, your gardens, your tenanted farms, and your income-producing properties entirely within my jurisdiction." Sir Aldous opened his mouth. No sound came out. "Your lease will not be renewed. Your tenancies will revert to the estate. You will, of course, be compensated at fair market value. I am not unreasonable, Sir Aldous, but you will no longer hold property in this county. Your magistracy, which was granted on the basis of your landholding, will therefore lapse. And the evidence we have compiled regarding your involvement in the fraudulent commission will be forwarded to the Lord Chancellor's office for review." He paused. "I am told the penalties for conspiring to defraud a peer of the realm are severe." The silence in the great hall was total. Not even the candle flames seemed to move. And then Pearl, who had been sitting in Marianne's lap throughout this performance with the implacable composure of a baby who has not yet learned to be afraid of men in wigs, picked up a biscuit from the plate on the table and threw it. It struck Sir Aldous Pembroke squarely on the chest, leaving a trail of crumbs down his waistcoat. No one laughed. That was the remarkable thing. Not Constantine, whose face remained as cold and controlled as marble. Not Marianne, though something glinted in her eyes. Not Aubrey, though his mouth twitched. Not the solicitors, not the barristers, not the man from the Lord Chancellor's office. But Pearl, 8 months old, entirely unconcerned with legal proceedings and boundary commissions and the ruination of corrupt magistrates, laughed. She laughed the way babies laugh, wholly, unreservedly with her whole body, at the simple, magnificent satisfaction of having thrown a thing and hit a target. Sir Aldous looked at the crumbs on his waistcoat. He looked at the baby. He looked at the Duke. "I think," Constantine said quietly, "my daughter has expressed herself clearly enough. You may go." Sir Aldous went. He left Silverton Castle, and he left the county, and he left public life entirely, because once the Lord Chancellor's office received the file that Harding and Harding had prepared, his legal career, such as it was, ended with the finality of a door slamming shut. He spent his remaining years in a rented house in Scarborough, living on a diminished income, occasionally writing letters to the county newspaper about the decline of local governance that no one printed and no one read. There was one more thing, one more piece of the story that needed to happen before Marianne's vindication was complete. The county assembly was held in August at the Guildhall in the market town of Broughton, 12 miles from Silverton. It was a gathering of the county's principal families, landowners, clergy, professionals, the minor gentry who formed the backbone of rural English society. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of event where reputations were made and unmade, and where the verdict of the community was delivered in the currency of acknowledgement. Who was greeted, who was cut, who was embraced, and who was ignored. Marianne attended on Constantine's arm. She wore a gown of deep blue silk, the first silk she had ever worn, with the pearl brooch at her throat, and her hair dressed simply, because she was not a woman who required elaboration. Constantine was in black, as always. They entered the Guildhall together, and the room, which had been buzzing with the particular energy of English social speculation, went silent. They knew who she was. Of course they knew. The story had travelled across the county like fire across dry heather. The seamstress who had saved the Duke's baby, the woman cast out by Thornsby, the future Duchess of Silverton. Opinion was divided. Some thought it was romantic, some thought it was improper, and some, the ones who had connections to Thornsby, who had heard Mrs. Buckle's version, who believed that a woman's station was ordained by God and could not be altered by a duke's whim. Some thought it was a scandal. Gerald Wick was one of these, a prosperous farmer from the Thornsby parish, a friend of Pembroke's, a man who had sat in the church hall and voted to take Pearl from Marianne's arms. He was standing near the punch table when Marianne and Constantine entered, and the expression on his face, the particular blend of outrage and disbelief that belongs to small men confronted with evidence that the world does not bend to their preferences, was visible from across the room. He approached. This was either courage or stupidity, and in Gerald Wick's case, it was almost certainly the latter. "Miss Croft," he said. His tone was the tone of a man addressing a servant who has wandered into the wrong room. "I see you've done well for yourself." The room was watching. Every eye, every ear, every social antenna was turned toward this moment, because this was the moment that would determine how the county received the future Duchess of Silverton. If Marianne crumbled, if she flushed, if she stammered, if she showed any sign of shame or uncertainty, the verdict would be swift and merciless. The county would file her under Duke's indiscretion and treat her accordingly for the rest of her life. Marianne looked at Gerald Wick. She looked at him the way she had looked at the blizzard and the empty moor and the men at her door, with the steady, measuring gaze of a woman who has survived worse things than this and knows it. "Mr. Wick," she said. 2 words, spoken calmly, without heat, without reproach, without the slightest indication that this man and his opinion had any power over her whatsoever. Then she turned and walked away, on the arm of the Duke of Silverton, into the room. The room responded, not with applause. This was not a theatre, and these were not people who made spectacles of themselves, but with something more powerful and more permanent. A shift. Marianne felt it happen in real time. The way you feel the wind change direction. The woman nearest the door, Lady Carston, wife of the county's largest landowner after Constantine, stepped forward and curtsied. Not a perfunctory bob, but a full, deliberate, unmistakable curtsy to the future Duchess of Silverton. "Your Grace," she said to Constantine, and then turning to Marianne with a warmth that was either genuine or expertly performed. "Miss Croft, we are so pleased to welcome you." Behind her, other women moved. Not all of them. Some stood rigid, their smiles frozen, their fans working overtime. But enough. Enough to signal that the county had made its calculation, weighed the evidence, and decided that the woman on the Duke's arm was not a scandal, but a story. And in a society that ran on stories, the story of the seamstress who saved the Duke's child in a blizzard was far more compelling than anything Gerald Wick and his Thornsby friends could offer. A matron in green silk asked Marianne about Pearl. A clergyman's wife complimented the brooch. An elderly dowager, the kind of woman whose opinion settled arguments before they began, examined Marianne through a lorgnette for a full 5 seconds, then declared, loudly enough for the room, "Good bones! Steady eye! That child will have a mother worth having." Constantine had not said a word. He had not needed to. But as they moved through the room, Marianne felt his hand tighten on hers, just once, just briefly, and she understood that the pressure was not anger. It was pride. It was the silent, ferocious pride of a man who had just watched the woman he loved walk into the one arena he could not control for her, the court of public opinion, and win it on her own terms. And Gerald Wick stood at the punch table with his glass and his outrage and his small, disappointed sense of the world's proper order, and no one spoke to him for the rest of the evening. Not one person. He left early before the dancing and rode back to Thornsby in the dark. But the village's reckoning was not confined to Gerald Wick and a county assembly. It came to Thornsby directly, in September, in the form of a carriage bearing the Silverton crest. Mrs. Buckle saw it first. She was sweeping the shop front when the horses came round the bend, and she dropped her broom and stood there with her mouth open while the most magnificent equipage Thornsby had ever seen rolled to a halt outside the vicarage. The carriage contained Lord Aubrey Vane, 2 solicitors, and a sheaf of documents pertaining to the Silverton estate's relationship with the village of Thornsby. The meeting that followed, held in the same church hall where Marianne had been condemned, lasted 4 hours. The vicar, Mr. Thwaite, emerged from it the colour of old porridge. Mrs. Buckle's husband was not present, but the draper's shop received a letter the following morning informing Mr. Buckle that his lease, which had been held under favourable terms from the Silverton estate for 23 years, would not be renewed at its current rate. The new rate, adjusted for fair market value and a correction in the acreage calculation, would triple his rent. No one in Thornsby formally apologised to Marianne Croft. No one wrote a letter. No one sent a delegation. But the village understood, with the clarity that only financial consequences can produce, that the woman they had cast out was now the wife of the man who owned the ground beneath their feet, and they would spend the rest of their lives negotiating the terms of that reality. Mrs. Buckle was seen once at the Crestwick market. Months later, after the wedding, after the story had settled into the county's permanent memory, and Marianne was there, buying ribbons for Pearl. Their eyes met across the stall. Mrs. Buckle opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the pearl brooch at Marianne's throat, the brooch that had once been pinned inside a dead woman's cloak, that had been repaired with diamonds, that now sat against silk instead of rough wool. She looked at it, and whatever she saw there made her turn away without speaking. Marianne watched her go. She felt nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even pity. She felt the clean, quiet freedom of a woman who has been released from the opinions of people who never deserved the power she gave them. That was the vindication, not the assembly, not the curtsies, not the boundary corrections or the tripled rents. The vindication was Marianne Croft, standing in a market square with her daughter on her hip and a duke's ring on her finger and feeling absolutely nothing for the woman who had once tried to destroy her. Because Mrs. Buckle did not matter. She had never mattered. The only thing that had ever mattered was a voice in the darkness, and the man who listened, and the choice they made together. Not in a ballroom, not in a church, but in a doorway on the moors, in the cold, in the silence, in the space between 2 people who had nothing and gave each other everything. Thank you for being here. Every view, every comment, every subscription means the world to me. This community is growing, and it is because of you. If you enjoyed this story, share it with someone who needs a good escape. This story reminds me why I do this, because somewhere in every tale of cruelty and injustice and impossible odds, there is a woman who refuses to disappear. And somewhere in the darkness, there is a man who has been watching, waiting, and believing in her worth long before the rest of the world caught on. If that resonated with you, tell me in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me your favorite moment. And if you have not subscribed yet, I would love to have you here for the next story. Until then, take care of yourselves. And remember, your worth is not determined by the people who could not see it. It is determined by you. I will see you next time.